Hey everyone, thanks so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Born with a mysterious power tied to the sea itself, a female Luffy grows up hunted by the world government long before she can understand why. When hiding her existence is no longer possible, salvation comes from an unexpected place: the legendary Whitebeard pirates. Taken aboard the Moby Dick alongside Ace, Luffy finds not just protection, but a family that teaches her strength, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong. As she grows under Whitebeard's flag, the story blends found family, adventure, and emotional growth, reimagining Luffy's journey through the warmth and ferocity of the Whitebeard pirates. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Daughter of the Sea by Kuchia-chi.
Chapter 26, Welcome Home. On the way back to the Moby Dick, Luffy found herself as the center of attention of the new pirates. They had began by telling her all about what the pirate life was like for them and how great they were with the destruction of villagers and the large amount of money they had hauled in from them. Luffy wasn't the type to judge a person, however she knew how wrong it was to hurt innocent civilians. She was going to have to question Whitebeard on who he led onto his crew. There were already a few people that she didn't trust already. The 12-year-old girl had tried multiple times to pull away from the crowd, to talk to the commanders and her brothers about her adventures, but they just kept talking and dragging her back. She was going to have to talk to them all when they got back to main ship. Luffy sighed out loud, and that had caught the attention of all of the new members. "Are you listening, Squirt?" the former captain of an unknown crew asked irritably. "No," Luffy just replied out of habit. She never listened to Whitebeard when he gave her orders. He wasn't her captain. She didn't have a captain. "We may be new members, but we're higher than you. You should be listening to what your higher-ups say." "Why?" "Because we've been pirates longer than you." That was when Marco came up to the group, since he knew where this was going and the new members weren't going to win this war. "How long have you been a pirate then?" Marco asked. The former captain looked up at the 1st Division commander and straightened up. 4 years, Commander Marco." At that point, Ace, Sabo and Namur had joined in on the argument that the members had brought upon themselves. Namur stepped up to the plate and took over from Marco. "Luffy-sama's been here since she was 4. Besides, she doesn't listen to anyone. Even if there are higher gods than her, she wouldn't listen to them." "Sorry to ask, Commander Namur, but you said earlier as well that she was a god. She looks pretty human to me. Best to show you." Namur signaled the little girl to come over. Luffy stood side by side the shark fishman, both watching the captain. "If you wouldn't mind, Luffy-sama." Luffy had ever strict orders not to show too many people, but they were part of the crew, so they were bound to find out, so all she did was smirked and changed into her red serpent form. This had scared the absolute shit out of the new members, as they watched the giant of a sea king come towards them and curl them up into a bundle with only her tail. She then proceeded to drop them at an easy height. Most of the crew had came out with a couple large bruises, but the higher-ups that had experience with the new world came out of it uninjured. They were at a loss for words. They had met different zone-type devil fruits, but their minds couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Luffy had changed back to normal and left while the group was in a sudden silence. She rubbed her stomach as she walked into the galley to find something to eat. Ace and Sabo had followed their little sister into the galley also. Their minds were going to have to take a little break for a while, and the little sea deity was happy with that and enjoyed catching up with her brothers. It was one of the most exciting times for Luffy, since she had spotted the main ship coming into view. She was jumping up and down on the railing, which scared some of the crew, thinking that she was going to fall in and sink to the bottom. What almost gave them a heart attack was when Luffy had jumped into the water voluntarily and swam at the speed of light. Luffy had caught herself in a swift current under the water and then changed her trajectory and shot herself out and onto the deck of the Moby Dick. It was wonderful to be home. Her father must have met a lot of crews over the 1 year, since a large quantity of them had their weapons out, while the members she knew had already charged at her and buried her under the pile of bodies that were trying to hug her all at once. Out of what little space she could see, she spotted Whitebeard leaning back in his giant chair, grinning widely. He could obviously see her, and his smile grew bigger as he watched her mouth. "I'm home." Chapter 27, Parties and Adventures. Luffy pulled herself out from under her overwhelming older brothers and ran to the safety of her father. The new recruits thought she was attempting to attack the old man and got in her way. Which wasn't the wisest choice in the world. All of those who had gotten in her way met face first with the wooden deck. The whole crew watched the small magical moment when their youngest jumped up onto the old man's lap and tackled his chest. The whole of the Whitebeard pirates had been called back to the main ship. Whether they were back in time wasn't completely determined. However, a party was thrown for the returned member of the crew, and even though the newest members didn't completely know Luffy as a person, they had definitely heard rumors about a mysterious brat that played more pranks on the crew than Sabo and Ace combined. Luffy was found on the old man's lap, with juice one hand and a cracker in the other. Whitebeard was never going to get over how alike her and her grandfather were. Whitebeard placed a large hand on the girl's head, the other holding onto the beer that the nurses had allowed him to drink. "So Squirt," the large man started, "are you going to tell us all about your little adventure? I'm sure most of us want to hear about it." There was a cheer as a reply and a clink of barrel mugs. "Do I have to? It's a lot of trouble." "Yes you do." There were another rounds of cheers, as they agreed with their captain. "I met this green hair guy called Zoro, he was funny. And Usopp's son, Usopp that he always talks about, almost as good as his father when it comes to shooting. You know I met some clown looking guy, he looked stupider than Shanks described him, and some weird girl that was on his ship. Can't remember her name, but then Gramps was also in the East Blue so I played with him and another guy called Sanji. Then I went to the North Blue." The story went on and on. There were a few shocked surprises and amazing scenarios that would never happen, but everyone had to agree that if or when they ever met this Eva-chan, they were definitely going to give him their personal thanks for turning their little girl into a girl. The crew could easily say that Luffy wasn't the type to go through extreme detail, and when there was a gap in the story, they couldn't be pressed for more information, but they could tell she was itching to move around more and party like everyone else. Soon enough Luffy had finished her story and went to play with everyone. The crew had gained the humiliation that wasn't missed a year ago, but were all on levels of happy that couldn't be expressed. Once Luffy had eaten her fill, she had went to her room that she shared with her brothers, down in the lower decks. However, when she opened the door to the room, she immediately noticed that her brothers' beds were missing. Luffy ran back up to the main deck where a large quantity of the crew was lying all over the place, after drinking their brains out. Luffy soon located her brothers having a drinking contest with a couple of the commanders. She jumped up into the air, and before any of the commanders knew what was happening, Ace had a pair of legs choking him around the neck and his face was now one with the deck. "Oi, why are Ace Knee and Sabo Knee's beds not in our room?" Luffy yelled. Thatch had sobered up when he heard Ace's face impact the deck. "Luffy, don't you think you're getting a little old to be having Ace and Sabo sleep in the same room as you? You're a big girl after all." Thatch argued. "But I don't want to sleep by myself. It's lonely." "Then sleep with the nurses. I'm sure they won't mind. I tried once, they're always throwing around that power stuff and wearing makeup and they try to make me wear it. It's not fun. It's icky." "Well, that might be true, but where are you going to sleep then?" That was sentence that shouldn't have been said, cause the commanders could see the cogs working in the 12-year-old's mind and that wasn't good. Luffy released her hold on her unconscious brother's neck and ran to across the deck. The commanders weren't going to like where the little brat was going and abandoned their drinking game. They followed the little girl across the main deck till they came face to face with an overly cheery 12-year-old and their captain staring down at the girl and then at them. "Who's responsible for this?" Whitebeard questioned. Thatch stepped forward with a sheepish expression. "I did, Pops, sorry about that." "Well then Luffy's going to be staying in your room first and then move to the next commander once the week's done." He turned his attention back to the straw hat wearing girl. "Is that fine with you?" "Yep." Luffy cheered and then proceeded to run around in circles around the unfortunate commander. However, at this point Luffy was filled with too much energy to control and was going to need some place to throw it around. When the hyperactive 12-year-old was too hard to handle for the hungover drunkards, they threw her overboard. They did it all the time when she was being too loud. Luffy wasn't the type to get disheartened and it had happened so often she simply didn't care anymore. So that night Luffy slept in the sea while her brothers sort through the alcohol in their systems and was the first one to breakfast the next morning. That day couldn't get any more like any other when Luffy was round causing havoc. The routine that followed also wasn't any different. Every morning started with a round of shouting coming from the lower decks that woke the whole ship, minus the old man. The root of it all was always one little girl that is always too excited for anything that comes her way. Combat training then followed if Luffy really wanted to eat breakfast. However, there were a few concerns floating around the next morning since the Moby Dick was landing on a completely new island that wasn't claimed yet, however formed the very looks of it. Heavy clouds, dark 24/7 and graves littered along the beach. Although this might have spooked most of the crew, it didn't stop the curious, and the most curious of all Luffy, who claimed that if she were lucky, she'd run into a ghost and even went to the old man for permission to keep it if she had his approval. Chapter 28, Ship Horrors. The Moby Dick pulled up onto the dark and heavily clouded island. The pirates held onto their pride while attempting to not shake in their boots. Pirates were capable of taking on their own opponents, but they weren't completely sure if ghosts were even real. "Come on Papa, can I?" Luffy's voice came from the main deck and it was whining. That was never a good sign. "No." The captain's voice boomed. Luffy wasn't the type to demand for many things. She was easy to please when you gave her some food or spar with her, but Luffy this time really wanted someone that she could be around and call a friend. After all, she was on a gigantic boat full of family. Don't get her wrong, she loves her family, but she wanted someone that she could talk to that won't report to Pops about every little detail. "Please, I want to find a ghost and make it my friend." Whitebeard slammed his Bisinto into the deck, thundering across the boards. "I said no." Fine, Luffy screamed at the top of her lungs. She fought back tears and ran onto the head of the Moby Dick. Before jumping onto the island, she turned back in a fit of anger and yelled, "I hate you." Whitebeard felt like an arrow had stabbed him in heart. The crew were shouting out to the girl but weren't having any luck. Thatch stood firm next to his captain and father and thought carefully about what he was going to say. "Pops, give Luffy some space, I'm sure she's restless from just getting back." The commander tried to comfort the man. Luffy ran as far as she could until she couldn't feel the eyes of her family on her back. She knew it wasn't going to take long until someone found her. After all, it was only going to take Marco to soar over the top of the island to find her. As Luffy came close to a darkened forest, she hesitated before going in. It was the new world and all sorts of things could have jumped out at them, but Luffy continued on firm and steady.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
She found it odd that there wasn't a single sound in the whole forest. She hadn't been running that long, but she couldn't even hear the voices of the crew. "Papa, Ace ni, Sabo ni," Luffy muttered. She was scared about being alone, but that was until she remembered what her father had said and the bitter anger had returned to her throat. She wasn't the type to hold a grudge against someone that she cared about, but she really wanted a friend. She wished she could have gone back and seen Usopp again or any of the other people she met on her journey. A slight breeze rustled the trees around the girl and a faint whisper caught her ear. "Come play," the voice whispered. It was the sound of a small girl. "Sure, I'd live to play with you. I'm Luffy." Luffy cheered. She spun around the small opening in the forest but couldn't see anyone in sight. "Where are you? Let's play." "Over here," the voice whispered. Luffy shuffled around and saw a small girl. She looked to be around 6 years old, deathly white that matched her frilled dress and thick dark curls. Her eyes were hollowed out, nothing but a dark abyss. This, however, didn't affect Luffy at all. All she did was smile and follow as she made her way towards a fallen-apart Victorian house. When she walked in, she let out a scream. Whitebeard couldn't cope with one of his family members being missing, let alone hating him. He wouldn't show it, but the crew could tell that he was busy sulking in his throne. Ace and Sabo had left their posts to comfort the man. They didn't really have the same issue with Luffy but stood by his side. There was an awkward silence around the ship. No one had spoken to each other unless it was important. It was only until one of the nurses had come up to the captain with a sheepish look on her face did anyone pay any attention. Captain," the nurse stammered. She was new and wasn't completely used to living with a whole lot of pirates. "Yes, what is it?" he slightly growled. Whitebeard was chugging down another barrel of beer, which didn't make the nurses happy in the slightest. "It's about Luffy. Ever since she's got back, she was always talking about those friends of hers that she met. I think she wants a friend, someone she can talk to without us watching over her." Whitebeard had to admit that his new nurse was right. His daughter was just lonely. She may have been the most cheerful soul someone could run directly into, but it didn't change the fact that she still had feelings. At that moment, a single scream pierced the whole dilemma on the ship and eyes snapped towards the island. "Luffy." Men were going after her, Whitebeard announced. Cheers spilled over the edge and the men were getting ready for a battle or rescue. Chapter 29, Monster House. Luffy screamed at the top of her lungs. She hadn't seen anything quite like it. All around the Victoria household were creatures of the unimaginable. A woman with her lower half in the form of a snake while she carried tea elegantly to the next room, a man in a butler suit with curled horns and goat's legs, and any other unknown creatures. Not a single creature even took a glance at the girl as the 12-year-old started sprinting around the castle like a nut job. The little girl in white watched despite not having eyes in her sockets at the hyperactive girl who had ran off only moments ago to explore all over the mansion. "Allison," a voice called out to the girl in white. She turned her attention to a beautifully stunning woman in only stripes of clothing made out of black leather that barely covered any parts of her body, along with impish black wing on her black thick as leather and spiked tail to match her wings. Her voice was as smooth and soft as velvet. This creature of the night had caused most of the deaths that were laid out on the beach. "A succubus. How are you, my dear?" she cooed sweetly. "Fine, I found myself a friend," she whispered. She couldn't talk very loud even though she didn't know why. Allison spun around the foyer of the mansion when she realized that her new friend was missing. However, she couldn't see the older girl. However, heard a scream of joy, and soon a man with his lower half of a horse soon burst into the room with the 12-year-old on his back with the widest grin on her face. The girl in white ran out in front of the raging horseman to calm him down before any of the more physical creatures got injured. The horseman stopped his rampaging the moment he noticed the girl in white, rearing up then bucking the poor pirate runaway off his back and sent her flying into the wall. "Ah, Luffy!" Allison screamed. The girl flew towards the wall and hit with a sickening thud. The creatures may have been sickening to the outside eye, however it didn't change the fact that the internals of another being was still a horrific sight. The mythical creatures turned away, however didn't hear the body hit the ground. "We lose most people that way," one creature commented. "Well, that could have hurt." Luffy cheered. All eyes turned back to the still grinning 12-year-old, whom then patted down her shorts and red vest and then ruffled her hair back into the untidy mess it always was. She placed both hands on her stomach and peered up pleadingly. "I'm hungry. Do you have anything to eat?" Luffy asked absently. "How can you be worried about that?" The horseman yelled in disbelief. Allison ran up and went to jump on her and hug the girl, however, flew straight through Luffy and out into the other room. Luffy blinked at the strange aura that was thick and heavy in the room, however the attention of the residents were distracted by the sudden thundering echo littered and bounded off the walls of the foyer. All eyes turned to the large double doors and the anticipation thickened the louder the pounding of feet got to the house. When the sound was so loud that it echoed so badly that some of the residents with more sensitive ears rushed out, the creatures that remained in the foyer readied themselves for a fight and the front doors burst open and the pirates piled in. There was a moment of silence and the feeling of war rumbled and thrived about the room, and the moment the pirates saw a dazed Luffy, that was enough to set them off and went to war against the creatures in the Victorian mansion. However, they didn't get far because Allison had jumped in between the two parties and asked for a moment of silence while she looked over her friend. All eyes turned to Luffy for some sort guidance on whether to believe the ghost girl or not. Luffy, however, started to sob when she saw her family come to get her but couldn't handle the fact that she had told her father that she had hated him and burst out of the room and deep into the unknown of the mysterious mansion. "Luffy!" the crew called out. The commanders tried to go after her but were blocked by mythical creatures that seemed to be rather overprotective of the girl. "What do you think you're doing? She's with us," one of the pirates screamed, desperate to get the 12-year-old back to the ship. "No," Allison cried. All went silent as they waited for the eyeless girl to continue with her rant. "She wanted a friend, someone that she could talk to anything and she doesn't have to get fawned over. You all seem to have forgotten that she is a god. She doesn't have that luxury." The pirates definitely stopped to think about their little girl for a moment and were ushered into an extremely large dining hall that was surprisingly enough capable of seating a large portion of the crew while Whitebeard stood, along with most of the commanders. They were all still very worried about Luffy and where she could have gotten to. That was until a large rumbling in the floor caused all of the men in their seats to stand back up and look around and arm themselves for a battle. The large double doors at the other end of the room burst open and in came in an overly happy, three-headed dog half the size of the old man, and as expected on the back was Luffy once again, finding that was completely unique and wanted to keep it. There was a big smile on the girl's face, but once the dog stopped she soon spotted her family at the scattered around the large dining room. Her face fell. She tried to escape once again, however, was dragged away by one 1st Division commander and flown to the other end of the room and dropped in front of her old man. "I'm sorry, Papa," Luffy muttered. Whitebeard gave a blank yet angry appearing look, but bent down and patted the girl on the head. "You shouldn't be the one apologizing. We should have thought about what it was like for you." With that the rest of the crew joined in encouraging the sea deity back to their giant silly family. "Really?" Luffy happily questioned. The crew gave a loud cheer and watched as she soon jetted back to the other end of the dining room where the three-headed dog waited and launched herself at its leg. "Can I keep him?" Luffy asked cheerfully. "No." The crew disagreed all at once. The carefree atmosphere was back and the crew was all back in one piece, with their little sister back at their side. Chapter 30. Full stop. When the drama from the previous island gone, the crew made a plan to keep an eye out for some sort of pet for their little sister. However, she was in the most odd of moods that baffled the pirates to an unbelievable measure. Ace and Whitebeard were one of the first to discover the bipolar personality that Luffy had picked up that morning when she started yelling at the captain of the ship about something preposterous. "But why must we eat fish?" Luffy yelled. Whitebeard gave a curious yet confused gaze down at his youngest. Luffy was wobbling and whining all over the main deck and had a dazed look about her. Whitebeard's first thought went to suspecting that Luffy had gotten into alcohol again and went on a rant about the uttermost random of things. "What if everyone could fly? I could send Gramps more of my pictures for the bounty posters." That was when Ace turned the corner and only heard half of the conversation that was spewing out his sister's mouth. He watched in anticipation as Luffy soon splayed out across the deck, face down, with her loose shiny black hair covered the deck and her arms and legs were far apart from each other. "I'm nothing but water and this body is only made of water," Luffy muttered depressingly. Then Whitebeard and Ace witnessed something that they weren't quite expecting from the girl. Luffy's physical body turned to seawater and just sat in a puddle in the middle of the deck. An awkward silence filled the air and neither of the pirates knew what to do about the puddle of water that sat perfectly still on the deck in front of the captain. They watched the water puddle for a few moments until the boat tipped to the side and Luffy's water puddle slid off the side of the Moby Dick and no one had stopped it. When Ace had finally grasped the situation at hand, he lost his lid. "Luffy's lost her mind," the second eldest brother cried out as he ran around the deck. The nurses that had witnessed the whole situation from a distance, only giggled to themselves and waited until one of the commanders came and sorted out their raving family member. Thatch was the first one on the scene and therefore held all responsibilities, so Ace ran straight to the fourth commander and tackled him to the deck. "Whoa, there Ace, you're not as young as when you first came on board. Something's terribly wrong with Luffy." Ace panicked. Thatch sat himself up and pushed the 15-year-old boy off of him and scratched the back of his head. The only one panicking was Ace, so the commander didn't see much in getting worried either. "So what's wrong with her?" Thatch finally asked. "Well, first she rambling on about all sorts strange nonsense and then turned into a puddle of water and slid off the side of the boat." Thatch paused for a moment, looked up for guidance from his captain and only got a rather oblivious look from the elder male. That was until the commander made eye contact with the still giggling nurses and a light bulb went off in his head, a faint tinge caressed his cheeks. Thatch turned back to his oblivious black-haired counterpart, stood up and walked back downstairs, hoping to get away from the scene. "Hey Thatch, get back here. Come on, tell me what's wrong with Luffy." "Sorry Ace, I just remembered that something came up a little while ago that I have to attend to immediately." "Thatch, you traitor." Ace sank back down into the deck when the fourth commander was out of sight and went back to Whitebeard. He was just about to say something when a familiar scream came from over the railings of the ship. The nurses rushed over to the railing and saw blood rising to the surface, only to be followed by a panicking Luffy. "Ace me, I'm bleeding from somewhere and I don't know what's happening." Ace started panicking again, but the nurses held the poor deluded teen back while the nurses went to get their little sea deity out of the water and run her through the ropes. There was a large set of confusion through the Moby Dick, however, settled later that day, but the crew prepared themselves for something that they weren't going to enjoy the 1 week that was going to follow every month from that day on. Chapter 31, Swift 17. Even though the three siblings had spent their time on the Moby Dick with an infamous pirates and everything seemed like it would never change, it was only a matter of time till and, however, it was now up. The sun rose on that day like any other, but this was a special day for one little soldier in particular and he wasn't planning on getting up that morning though. That was until his sister came barging in and jumped on top of him like it was Christmas morning. "Sabo ni, get up, get up, get up, guess what day it is?" Luffy screamed at the top of her lungs. The curly blonde-haired teen only rolled over and groaned at his little sister's excitement towards a day that he really couldn't care less about, plus he had spent the whole previous night with the crew sorting out the shipping containers and checking their stock. "Luffy, just get off of me and we can talk about it later." Sabo whined. "But Sabo ni, it's your—" Luffy was abruptly cut off by Ace, who seemed pleased with himself that he stopped Luffy from reminding Sabo of such an exciting day. Ace began carrying Luffy back out of Sabo's room and before he closed the door with his foot, he poked his head. "Sabo, rest up, you had a long night. Just make sure that you're up before 12. I highly doubt that you want to miss this." The eldest brother, not caring what Ace was blabbering on about, turned himself over, pulling the bedsheet over his head and went back to sleep. Ace closed the door behind and rushed back out main deck so he could scold Luffy on almost giving away the surprise. "Luffy, you know you're not supposed to tell Sabo." Ace growled. Luffy sheepishly smiled and rubbed the back of her neck with a stupid grin plastered on her face. "Sorry, I forgot." "Of course you forgot. Now, you're in charge of having the other boat prepared," Ace instructed. Luffy straightened up and gave a salute and dashed off to perform her task. Sabo had enjoyed his sleep in, but there was something at the back of his mind that he couldn't quite get a hold of, something itching at the back of his head that he seemed to have forgotten, and then he remembered Luffy screaming about something important. Reluctantly, Sabo sat up in his bed, looked around his room and calmed down a bit when he saw that no one was there. He didn't know what time it was but knew in the very least that it was before 12 and began getting dressed in his usual blue coat, cravat, black short and boots. He remembered that he was in charge of training some of the new recruits that afternoon and need to get into shape. Sabo sighed, grabbed his pole that leant on his side table and began making his way to the dining hall. Sabo didn't know why but was sighing a lot that day and couldn't quite put his finger on it, but soon began to wonder what Luffy wanted him up so early for. The brother continued daydreaming until he made his way into the dining hall and found it to be empty. He gave it a curious look, shrugged and went straight into the kitchen. The chefs were there busy preparing something and Sabo didn't really care, but he still gave them the silent thumbs up for their work and went and grabbed himself an apple. As he was walking out, one of the chefs stopped him. "Hey, Sabo, Commander Thatch wanted me to give this to you when you woke up," the chef said. Sabo, thoroughly confused, took the piece of paper that was handed to him and looked at it as he walked out. It was a note that read, "The new recruits are waiting, but somewhere where they can have a drink." Sabo wasn't stupid when it came to his family and knew exactly where Thatch's dumb little riddle was going to take him, the lowest deck cellar. Luffy had finished her job early and stayed on the main deck watching her oldest brother running about trying to connect all of the notes that they decided to give him. It Haruta that came up and organized the whole party and surprises along the way. Occasionally, Luffy would hear Sabo scream and thrash around the lower decks at some of the surprises that the commanders had left for him. Most of the time Sabo would return to the main deck exhausted and glare at Luffy accusingly, but she would only laugh and run off, only to return a few moments later. When Sabo had finally received the final note, which told him go to the back of the boat, he pulled his blonde locks out of his face and rubbed his eyes. He spent at the very least 2 hours fighting and wandering around the ship and he was so tired that his mind wouldn't rest. But he was glad when he reached the back of the Moby Dick to see the whole crew there waiting for him with a huge banner that said, "Happy Birthday Sabo." The blonde teen couldn't believe that he had forgotten his own birthday and it was his 17th, which meant that at the day that he set sail and made his own crew. Sabo was soon tackled by Luffy and Ace with their overly cheerful greetings. "Happy birthday, Sabo ni." Luffy screamed, "Sorry, I couldn't tell you, Ace wouldn't let me." "Yeah, well it was a good thing too. Did you see that look of surprise he got when he saw us? It was amazing and if wish that was on camera." Ace cheered. A hand pulled Ace away from the rest of the group and the black-haired teen came face to face with Thatch, who proudly displayed the camera that he carried with him everywhere since the three of them came on board. "Thatch, you're a legend. You know that," Ace hollered. "Of course I know that, kiddo. Who do you think you're talking to?" The fourth commander cried. "Now why are we all just lounging around? This is a party." With that the crew erupted into song and cheer and drinks, and Sabo was more than overjoyed to spend everything he had with his family and know was his time to make his own. Sabo, after a few drinks, stood up on one of the tables and called everyone's attention by throwing a glass against the side of the boat. "Everyone, I want to thank you for throwing this amazing party, and even though I really don't appreciate getting sent around the place, secretly doing you chores so I could get the next note." There was manic laughing from the other end, but Sabo still continued, "But I want to give a very special thank you to 1st Division Commander Marco for saving my life on that day." A round of applause went out to the embarrassed commandant, who helped himself to another pint. Whitebeard, the greatest dad that a boy could ask for. Cheers of agreement met the boy. Thatch for his stubbornness for snapping the greatest memories that we have, and finally my brother and sister, Ace and Luffy. That came along with me on this amazing and life-explicit adventure that is the Whitebeard crew. Glasses clinked and cheers could have been heard from the closest island, but nobody cared. The party continued until the limited booze ran dry and 80% went to bed early. But those that remained saw Sabo get into a small boat with Luffy, prepared by Luffy, cast themselves into the New World Sea and made their way to the East Blue. Luffy had directed the sea to give them the quickest path to the East Blue and took them until the next day, and the pair met reached Dawn Island with Makino and the mayor waiting for them. "Well, if it isn't Troublemaker, and his little sister." Mayor complained happily. "It's so good to see you, Sabo. You've grown up, you're so handsome." Makino complimented. Sabo blushed and rubbed the back of his neck with a smile. "Thanks for seeing me off, you guys. No trouble at all." Before Sabo got back into the small boat that he was given, he crouched down to Luffy's height, patted her on the head, ruffling her hair with Shanks' hat, and gave her a huge smile. "Now you be good for Ace and Pops. I don't want to heard about any trouble that going on, okay?" "Yep." Luffy grinned. Sabo went to stand back up but was stopped by Luffy grabbing his coat. He crouched back down to meet her eye. "What is it, Luffy?" Luffy pecked her brother on the cheek and gave him the biggest grin he ever saw. "You're going to be a great pirate, but not as good as me. 'Cause I'm going to be king." Sabo rubbed the cheek that he felt his sister blessed, stood back up and ruffled her hair again. He got in the boat and began to sail off. Only until he was over the horizon did Luffy decide that it was time to return back home to the Moby Dick. Chapter 32, ANQs. Chapter 33, History Lesson. It had been more than a month since Sabo had left the Whitebeard pirates, and Luffy was already missing him terribly. She hadn't heard any news about him what seemed like forever to her. The little 12-year-old would wander around the ship aimlessly for hours, only cheering herself up when she was able to do her daily sparring practices. It was lucky for her that they had landed on one of their islands, and that brought a whole new wave of excitement. She darted towards the railing and was about to jump down, however, was snagged by the back of her red vest by Jozu, the 3rd Division commander. "Oh, come on, Jozu ni, one little peek. It's not going to hurt anyone," Luffy complained. "Letting you run around is bad for our hearts." Jozu replied dryly. The pirates of the 3rd Division nodded in agreement behind their commander, and Luffy only gave them a blank look. "So, if someone comes with me, I can go." Jozu thought about it but didn't say anything. He gently placed the girl back on the deck and told her to go ask the captain. So with that, Luffy sprinted off to Whitebeard to ask if she could go and explore the island. Even though she would have waited until the crew turned their back and she would have just jumped ship, but something to her didn't feel right to her. The island had a huge temple at the top of the hill and it was giving her the creeps. When Luffy finally got up to Whitebeard, she didn't hold back anything at all. "Papa, can I go to the island? That temple at the top of the hill is weird." Whitebeard knew about the origins of the islands that he took under his wing, and this one in particular. He wasn't so sure that it was the best for Luffy. After all, Fishman Island and this island weren't her favorite since both islands worship the god of the sea. "It's fine by me, however, you must take someone that will go with you." Whitebeard agreed. Luffy whined. She didn't see why she had to be babysat, but she did bring on herself. She was already 12, and she could have looked after herself without any trouble, but her father's orders were her orders. Luffy spent the whole day trying to find someone to take her to shore, but not to her luck, everyone was busy. Even Ace, who wasn't even officially part of the crew. Luffy spent the rest of her day, sitting on the figurehead of the Moby Dick, staring intently at the temple at the top of the island. It looked really old and on the sides had large waterfalls came from the inside. that flowed out to the sea. She couldn't quite figure it out, but it seemed like it was drawing her in and not in a good way. The sea god shook her head roughly and continued to stare at the island. Subconsciously Luffy grabbed onto her necklace. She stared down at the mystical gold seashell with her name engraved into it. She was surprised with the amount of gold that was left. She only had her seashell left. If someone took that, then she would have had to live in the sea for the reset of her life. She clicked the seashell undone, and inside there was a very small vial that contained sparkling blue liquid. Luffy wasn't surprised that she hadn't used it. It was used only in case of a life or death situation on one human that the daughter of the sea sees fit. Luffy thought about everyone on the ship, and in the back of her head she knew that she was missing someone. That was when it hit her. Jumping up, Luffy sprinted off of the figurehead and down to the main deck. She looked around and he wasn't there. She ran to his room and knocked on his door. "Come in," the gruff voice yelled out. "Papa, can you take me to the temple at the top of the hill?" Luffy giggled, feeling silly for forgetting that her father was able to leave the ship. Well, she couldn't blame herself. Whitebeard was always strapped down by his nurses and couldn't go anywhere. "I would love to." Luffy gave an ear-to-ear grin and bounced up and down. The little she-devil climbed onto her father's neck so her head rested on the top of his bandana. She was so happy that she was able to find someone to go with her. Luffy brimmed with excitement. "Brat," Whitebeard called out, "you should know that this island are one of the worshippers of the sea god. Whether you keep a low cover or not is not my business. I'm just warning you, don't cause too much trouble." "Okay." Whitebeard was happy that he got a chance to have some father-daughter bonding time, and even though it wasn't the most private, since his haki told him that the rest of his crew was right behind him, but he didn't care. Whitebeard grinned under his crescent beard, because he knew that only he and a partner were able to enter the temple, which meant that his crew had to wait outside or get back to doing their job. "Ah, Whitebeard, it's excellent to have you here." A small middle-aged man grinned up at the gentle giant. He wore a white robe and a golden headpiece. He was the head of the temple. "Hugo, good to see you. I see your temple has gained more followers since the last time I came." "Yes," Hugo cheered. He led the two further into the aqua-decorated and marble temple. "We've had a large increase in followers since the daughter of the sea was born just 9 years ago. She is a subject of the world's beauty." Whitebeard was glad to hear that Luffy was going to prosper well. However, it gave him the concern about suitors. He was going to have to be tough on any new recruits. "That's great to hear. What would you do if you met the sea goddess?" Whitebeard asked. He felt Luffy shiver at the question, but knew that she was curious as well as to how her temples were being run. "Oh, it is not a matter of if, Whitebeard. Our sea goddess has come to us, and that is where I'm taking you." "Is that so?" Luffy moved from being piggybacking on Whitebeard and slid down his extended arm and landed on the marble tiles and closely followed behind the head of the temple, like an excited puppy. "So," Luffy started, "who is this sea goddess you guys keep talking about?" Whitebeard watched and wondered whether or not his daughter was feeding her own ego or was finding out information on the fake that they had in their temple. "Our goddess is as beautiful as they come. She has a beautiful blue tail and her beauty can't be compared to any jewel." Luffy raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything and continued to listen to the man rant on about the girl's amazing power to talk to the fish, however, only minor fish like those that were found on dinner plates. Luffy wasn't going to expose the girl for who she really was, however, just observe the situation, and if anything seemed out of hand, that was when she was going to join in their little fiasco. When Whitebeard, Luffy and the priest walked into the main room, they were taken aback by its beauty. Water reflection moving all over the room and deep ponds filled large portions of the room, and Whitebeard had a little trouble walking in the narrow pathway but didn't say anything. Luffy looked around the place and felt a sense of familiarity. "Mama," Luffy whispered, "this place is weird. It's this great-grandma's house." Luffy listened to her mother whisper the information that she wanted and soon found out that this was where her rogue great-grandmother. She was the reason that the devil fruit existed in the first place. The current sea deity shivered. She hated have to be forced to have the horrible memories of her great-grandmother. "Who dares come to see the sea goddess?" a voice yelled out. The priest knelt down and told the little 9-year-old that Whitebeard, the protector of the island, had come to see her, along with one of his crewmates. Luffy was going to object to being called one of Whitebeard pirates, but her father just held a hand on her shoulder to keep her quiet. "You may speak," the small blonde girl yelled. Whitebeard and Luffy looked at each other and helped themselves to sit on what floor was available. They stared at the imposter. She was only 9 years old with long blonde hair and a blue mermaid tail. They both wondered what was so great about her. All they saw was a spoiled brat. "I'm Monkey D. Luffy." Luffy grinned. The mermaid only glared at her. "A peasant, I see. Well, you should know who I am. I'm the sea goddess, Lure T," the girl announced proudly. "Priest, leave me alone. I want to speak to these two in private." But, they're pirates. We can't leave you unguarded." "I said leave. Are you defying me? I will have your head." The girl screamed and the priest ran out as fast as he could. Luffy was building anger. The priest had talked nothing but good about her and ecstatic about her being there, and that was how she treated him. "How could you say that about that Buffy priest guy? You dare yell at the goddess of the sea?" Lure T yelled. Whitebeard sat back and watched his daughter get angrier about the fact that she treated the people horribly instead of the fact that she was the true god. The mermaid got up and grabbed Luffy and dragged her into one of the ponds. She started dragging her further and further into the specially made pool. Luffy found it amusing to blow bubbles to make it seem like she was drowning. When they reached the bottom of the pool, she flipped her head and grinned at the fake god. Just kidding. Luffy grinned and punched the girl in the face. Luffy changed into her small serpent form, curled her tail around the girl's waist and began swimming back up. Luffy stared wide-eyed at the serpent that was dragging her back up to the surface. She had heard all about sea deity from when she was just a guppy and heard of how powerful she is, and now she was on the bad side of a god. The worst that could have happened to her was being exiled. It was when the god's voice rang throughout the sea and the land that their existence has been withdrawn and never to feel or do anything again. Tears filled in Luffy's eyes. She didn't want to be exiled. She was only being put in that dumb position because her mother wanted her to live the high life like the royals, and that humans were nothing but suckers when you told them the right words. Luffy flew out of the water still in her dragon-like form and clawed her way around the marble room, pulling the blonde weeping mermaid onto the floor along with her. Luffy gave a chilling roar that spread throughout the island, and soon the residents and the Whitebeard pirates were soon rushing into the temple. The large groups of people were in a panic as they watched the ruby serpent wrapped around the mermaid. Luffy's dragon head came close to the girl, who jumped at the sight of the head. I'm so sorry. My mother wanted me to do it. The girl whimpered. Listen, these people look to you for support, not so that you will lap in luxury. I will let you off, but if I hear about this sort of behavior again, you're going back to Fishman Island with your crimes of imposing as a god. Luffy nodded her head viciously and watched the serpent began acting like a puppy to the girl, and all of the sea god followers began smiling and cheering, saying that Luffy had tamed the wild beast. That was until Whitebeard stood up and all eyes were on him. Well then, your highness, would you like me to take that back out to the sea for you? The little blonde mermaid looked to Luffy for guidance, and she winked and rushed over the giant, climbed up him like a tree and curled around his neck. Gururara, Whitebeard laughed. Boys were leaving. Most of the pirate clicked their tongues at the fact that they were caught so easily by their captain. As they walked out, Whitebeard looked at the purring serpent. Luffy, you've got some answers to the questions that I'm going to ask. Luffy changed back to her human form. She sat on her father's shoulder. What's that, Papa? You had a weird feeling about that temple, and I highly doubt that it was the fact that there was a fake, so what was that? I asked Mama what that feeling was. Turned out it was my great-grandmother's. Whitebeard stayed silent, knowing that his questions were all going to get answered in the story that she was about to say. My great-grandmother was the first sea god to go rogue. She would kill, slaughter and enslave, any and all. The other gods fought her, and her punishment was being torn to pieces, and each part was affected by all of the different gods and changed into the devil fruit. Each generation since then has to bear with the memories of all of the carnage of what she's done. I hate her and the devil fruits. Luffy explained. That was what, 4,000 years ago. What about your mother? Same thing, can't stand being near a pure devil fruit. I don't think she did anything with her life up until she 900, lived in some stupid cave. Whitebeard didn't say anything. Do you have a dad? What do you mean? Luffy wondered. After all she did was call Whitebeard Papa. Do you have a blood father? Yeah, the first person to pick me up as a baby. Luffy thought really hard, trying to get her memories that far back. Name, Dragon, that's it. And Gigi really is my grandpa. Whitebeard didn't show any reaction to the name. He really didn't care who anyone's background was, but it was a little surprising that she was related to the revolutionary leader, but he was more surprised that Garp even had a son. He found it rather suspicious though why Dragon would pick up a kid, and then suspected that he wanted Luffy the same as the world government, but changed his thought because otherwise he wouldn't have left Luffy on the island, which only made the man all that more mysterious. Luffy, have you ever met your old man? Nah, never. I just know his name. After all, he's the one that picked me up. Whitebeard knew that Luffy wouldn't know anything about her dad's background and probably wouldn't care. She wasn't one for history. Anything else that you want to tell me about before you turn 17 and leave to make your own crew? Oh, 17, yeah, Luffy remembered. When I turn 17, that's when my memory becomes like a human's. I won't remember anything in as much detail. I'll basically become human but not completely. I'll still be a mermaid and sea king, but I'm not immortal after that. My heart stops beating and I lose all of my memories and start life again. When the pair made it back to the Moby Dick, and Whitebeard had a huge insight on his youngest daughter's heritage and picked up a lot of do's and don'ts, but feared that if Luffy died earlier than she's meant to, then she wouldn't remember any of the crew and knew that it would break his heart. Whitebeard sat in his throne and thought long and hard about Luffy, but didn't put any thought to action. He watched his crew wander around the deck and noticed a flash go off and the sound of something hitting the water. Ace and Thatch were at it again with taking Luffy's pictures. That was until a thought popped up into his head and waited until his 16-year-old son finally got dragged out of the water. When Ace was out, Whitebeard called him over. Son, why do you take those pictures? Ace knew that he couldn't give the same excuse he gave Marco when he asked when Lucci was still around. He knew that Whitebeard had heard more about Luffy's heritage. I guess you heard then. Whitebeard only nodded his head. One day Luffy's going to do something stupid and it's going to cost her too much for us to handle, so even since we were little we took photos of everything that went on around us, in case she forgets, and I know when that time comes she'll really appreciate it. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Daughter of the Sea by Kuchia-chi. Chapter 34, Fountain of Youth. It had been days since the Whitebeard crew had seen or even came near an island, and Luffy 12 was bored out of her brain. She just wanted to land on an island soon and explore the place. Fishing wasn't enough to satisfy her curiosity, and Ace, 16, was determined to beat Sabo since his bounty poster had been released with the price of 15,000 berries once he had entered the Grand Line. Luffy carried Sabo's bounty poster in her pocket and refused to give it up and put it on the board with the rest of the bounty posters because she wanted to have Sabo with her while he was away and promised to put back when Ace got his bounty poster. The ship was quiet that day, the clouds were hanging low around the ship and a rather depressing atmosphere made it hard for the crew to be active. The commanders were lying around the deck with drinks in their hands, talking to each other about their current whereabouts and what they were going to do when they landed on the next island. "Oi, Papa, when are we going to land on an island? I'm bored," Luffy screeched as she jumped in front of the old man's line of vision. Whitebeard gave a hearty laugh and bent down to pat his youngest on the head. He looked out towards the sea with misty eyes. He was tired from staying up a little late dealing with the location of the next island and needed a good beer to wake him up. "We'll be there soon, kiddo. I can see it on the horizon now. Get the nurses to help you pack a bag, we're going to be there for a couple of days." "Why days?" Luffy questioned. She wondered what type of island they were landing on could possibly take days for them. If it was a small island she knew she was going to be bothered by the lack of excitement, and Marco had already told her that the island that they were heading towards was already uninhabited. So the whole idea of hang around was just bothersome to say the least. "The log pose will take a couple of days, Luffy. Now go pack your bag, I've got a drink to finish and your brothers are going to need a headache later." "I'll leave it to you," Whitebeard boomed. Luffy gave a mocking salute. "Leave it to me, Papa. They won't know what'll hit them. That's my girl." As Luffy dashed off to her room, the men on the deck groaned simultaneously and gave their captain half-assed glares while he laughed into his barrel of beer. Luffy had rushed into her room that she was forced into after Sabo left. She gathered up a hoard of useless things that were going to cause trouble to her brothers into a small backpack and rushed out when she felt the boat pull up onto land. Luffy snuggled into her straw hat. She adjusted the overly filled backpack and jogged out into the hallway and up onto the deck. The crew was busy anchoring the ship, so Luffy ducked and jumped over the crew as she made her way over to the railing. However, when Luffy had jumped onto the thick wooden railing she was met with the disappointment. The island was largely desert, there wasn't a sight of civilization anywhere, but that didn't stop Luffy in the slightest. "Hey, Luffy," Marco's voice called out from the other side of the deck. "What are you doing? Wait, you idiot." Marco watched as Luffy jumped off of the ship without a second thought and began running, with realizing the consequences of what her actions were going to cost her. Marco gathered his things and passed them off onto an unexpected crewmate and apologized about the inconvenience. "Pops," Marco shouted out, "I'm going after Luffy. I'll be back with her in a little while. Take care of that little troublemaker. I get the feeling that she's going to come back with something big." Whitebeard replied, "Please don't jinx the ship, Pops. You know what that does to my health." "I'm joking, now go find that brat." Marco transformed into a phoenix and flew into the air and sped off into the horizon after the youngest crewmember of the Whitebeard pirates, and it was an exhausting job. "Luffy," Marco screeched across the desert. The phoenix's eyes scanned around the area in hopes of find a spot of running red and an eccentric giggle. That was when he spotted a huge pond surrounded by palm trees towards the center of the island. Did he see a faint red in the water and figured that it was just the person he was looking for. Marco parked his fiery butt onto the ground and shouted out over the water for Luffy to get out and help with the rest of the crew with anchoring the ship. The crystal clear water rippled and the huge ruby sea king pulled itself onto the sandy beach. The huge head that tripled the size of Marco rested on the beach, stared coldly at the first commander until it was flicked in the face and began to pout. "Luffy, turn back. We've got work to do," Marco commanded. A spot of light blinded the commander for a moment and soon vanished, but in its place was no longer the 12-year-old girl that Marco knew but a 16-year-old Luffy. Her hair had grown longer but only by a short amount to her shoulders, and her normally well-fitted red shirt became tight about her bust as well as her shorts around her waist. Marco remained rather stoic despite the sudden change in Luffy's age, again. However, he took off his shirt and tossed it over to Luffy to cover herself more. "Put that on," Marco ordered. "But I've already got a shirt," Luffy replied childishly. "Put it on and you might want to take a look at yourself before we go back to the ship." Luffy stared blankly at her brother and then noticed that saw him from a different height and then looked down at herself and cried out at the sudden size of her bust. "Marco Nee, I've become like Nee-chan's." Luffy ogled. Right, Marco became a hybrid, picked up Luffy by his talons and began to fly back to the Moby Dick. "Something tells me Pops knew about something on this island and let you run off to give us some trouble." Chapter 35, Important Author's Rant. Chapter 36, To the City. The 1st Division commander, Marco, wasn't in the happiest of moods on the day the Moby Dick had landed on their latest island, but he couldn't blame anyone but himself. He had volunteered for Luffy sitting duty when he saw her run off the ship and into the desert. Now he was flying back in his hybrid form with an older and bustier Luffy in his talons. He sighed heavily when he heard Luffy complaining about food again and that she wanted to explore the island some more. Luffy, you've got a lot of explaining to do. Marco scolded, Ace is going to be looking after you from now on. You're not allowed to leave his side. If I hear that you did, you're grounded for a month. What? Luffy shouted. Luffy began to pout and gave Marco the silent treatment until they arrived back at the Moby Dick. Marco flew overhead of the mainmast and dropped Luffy from the deadly height, knowing fully well that it wasn't going to hurt her. Whoa! Luffy shouted almost gleefully as she landed on the main deck, covering her legs in scales to withhold the impact that Marco dropped her from. Watch it, Marco knee. I'm not sorry, kiddo. Of course you're not. Luffy grinned. Luffy stood up. She toppled a bit since she wasn't used to her new body that the pond she was swimming in had given her. Luffy straightened out Marco's shirt and pulled her now tight shorts up. Luffy's current older body had caused a ruckus on the ship. The men had pulled out their weapons and pointed it at Luffy like she was an intruder. Whoa, guys. It's me, Luffy. Luffy held up her hands in resistance. There's no way a girl as cute as you could be our Luffy, imposter. One of the men shouted. Luffy collapsed to the ground, not because her brothers called didn't think that she was cute but because they didn't think that it really was her. Papa, Luffy shouted out in last hope. Whitebeard looked down at his little girl who was older than she was. He had heard rumors about the island containing a fountain of youth but didn't believe it to be true, but he knew that his cheeky daughter would be the one to find it regardless. Come here, Luffy. Whitebeard held out his hand to his daughter. Luffy used her father's hand as a stepping stone to jump up and into the old man's chest, hugging him until she let out tears. Whitebeard knew of Luffy's fears of being forgotten by her friends and the burden that she carried as a sea deity. After all, they were her family and she knew it, and she was never going to forget it. Papa. Luffy wailed into Whitebeard's chest as the crew that accused Luffy of being an imposter shuffled around uncomfortably. Whitebeard gave an understand look to his boys and watched as they gathered in front of Whitebeard. Luffy. Luffy wiped her eyes and turned to see her brothers knelt before her with their heads on the ground. We're sorry. They shouted at the top of their lungs. Luffy wiped her eyes of any more tears. The crew lifted their heads, gathering every detail of Luffy's face. They watched as she lifted a delicate finger closer to her eye, pulled down her eye socket and stuck her tongue at her brothers. You idiots, did you really think I'd cry because you're a bunch of idiots? Luffy taunted, jumping off of Whitebeard's lap and onto the deck, only to get chased around the ship by the men that fell for her little trap. As Whitebeard watched his sons play with the youngest child, Marco landed next to his throne. There's a city around the other side of the island. It'll take about a day get around, Pops. Marco questioned. Nothing. Whitebeard replied, it's great having such lively kids around. Set sail for the other side of the island then, maybe we can find some way to turn Luffy back to normal. Pops, you worried that you're going to have to marry Luffy off early? Marco stated cheekily. Don't you have work to do, Marco? Whitebeard grumbled as he proved Marco's point. Marco smirked and left his captain to get nagged at by the nurses. Marco was about to walk down into the lower levels of the ship when he spotted someone in particular around the other side of the main mast with a camera. Marco walked over to the 4th Division commander. Thatch, what are you doing with the camera again? Thatch looked up to his superior with an ear-splitting grin on his face. Once Luffy leaves the ship we won't see our precious princess for a long time. So we'll have to have a picture for ourselves, won't we? Marco could only sigh. Just make sure Luffy doesn't catch you. She'll throw you in the sea again. You know how much we hate fishing you out, Thatch. No problem, Marco. Thatch cheered. I'm going to show Ace these pictures, it'll give him a heart attack. Thatch ran off down into the lower decks of the ship. Thatch! Marco shouted out, the boy's only 16. Luffy had scared most of the crew with her, yet again, sudden growth, and was excited when she heard that they were going to a city on the other side of the island. Ace had immediate ran to Luffy's aid when he saw the pictures Thatch took and going to burn them, but Thatch, having the upper hand, didn't hand them over. The nurses took Luffy to their rooms and had her dress more appropriately, although Luffy didn't really care as long as they weren't treating her any different as they usually did, and made them promise her that they weren't going to get her in a dress. The night was long and Luffy had slept out in the crow's nest that night. She watched the stars that were named after her godly brothers and sisters. She wondered what they were like and wondered if she was ever going to meet them. Luffy slept well that night but woke up the next morning with drawings all over her face, and she immediately knew who the culprit was. Luffy still wasn't very functional in her new body and had the nurses dress her. They tried to get her into a bra, but Luffy kept complaining about how tight it was and instead gave her a loose black bikini top and a red button-up shirt and large, more comfortable jean shorts, and she was ready to go out into the city. Luffy remembered her promise to Marco and had Ace accompany her when she was around the city. They were also accompanied by some of the pirates from the 1st Division and the 3rd Division since neither Marco or Jozu wanted something extremely dangerous to happen while they were on an island that they didn't know about, and especially with Ace and Luffy together was definitely going to cause trouble. The group walked down the street easily since it was a pretty neutral territory, and they asked around about the pond of youth Luffy swam in. They were told to go to the witch that lived on the outskirts of the city, and they did just that. Luffy was the first to immediately run off away from the group, dragging Ace along with her to find the witch. She was really excited about a witch. She rarely saw one or one that she could remember. Luffy, slow down. We'll get there soon, Ace reasoned. Luffy didn't stop though, and they were there in no time, flat at a little cottage in the middle of nowhere, and Ace politely knocked on the door with one hand while the other smashed Luffy over the head to keep her quiet. Come in, children, an old voice called out. Ace opened the door and looked into the room where herbs and vials were all over the place along with books. Sorry for the intrusion, but we heard that you would know about a cure for the Fountain of Youth. My idiot sister went swimming in it and we don't know how to change her back. Ace explained. The old woman smiled and walked over to her cupboard, opening it up and pulled out a small vial. Here, Sonny, this'll do the trick. The old woman smiled. I always have people coming in about that annoying pond. It really causes a lot of trouble, but your sister's lucky that she's got a good heart, otherwise the pond would have taken her like the rest. Luffy didn't understand what the woman was going on about and didn't think much of it. She took the vial from Ace's hands, thanked the old lady for her help and gulped it down in one go. It didn't take long till Luffy was coughing up the contents because of the vile taste. Ace and the old woman laughed but were glad when they saw Luffy's body shrink back to her regular 12-year-old size. By the time Ace and Luffy had returned to the city, they gathered up their missing group and went back to the Moby Dick. But it didn't take long till Luffy was complaining again about her boredom. Chapter 37, Ace. It was New Year's Day, also known amongst the Whitebeard pirates as Ace's birthday and coronation of becoming his own pirate. A wild party was thrown, and Ace, despite being a bit grime about his birthday like he always had, he felt a bit of joy about becoming his own pirate. Luffy, Ace shouted out across the deck. Luffy looked up from her meals and saw Ace waving his free hand. I'm counting on you to get me back to Dawn Island, baby sister. Count on me, Ace Nee. Luffy cheered. The pirates that have known Ace for a majority of his life all walked up to him and gave him their regards, and that they weren't going to go easy on him just because they were brothers. Don't think I won't give my all either. Ace returned. The Whitebeard pirates partied the whole night long. Luffy was forced to bed early since she was in charge of taking Ace back to the East Blue. Luffy stared up at the roof of her room as she listened to the laughter, cheers and song of her brothers and sisters on the above deck. It's going to be a long 3 years. I'm going to miss Ace, but we'll meet again on the sea. Luffy muttered to herself. Luffy drifted to sleep and awoke early the next morning. She ran to the galley immediately, where the chefs were already cooking food for the whole crew. Luffy, mornin', the head chef called out. I'm hungry, Luffy replied. Not when you haven't washed up, you're not. Fine. Luffy sagged her shoulders and turned out of the galley to go take a shower and brush her teeth. When she got to the bathroom, she found Ace already brushing his teeth with a huge grin on his face. Ace looked over to Luffy and tipped his head that indicated her to look just outside of the bathroom. Luffy stuck her head out of the doorway and noticed a huge sack full of Ace's things. You're really leaving, Ace Nee? Yeah, Ace muffled. He finished up his morning routine alongside Luffy and continued their conversation as they made their way to galley. Don't worry, Luffy, we'll definitely meet again on the seas. It's vast after all. Yep, the two of them ate their fill of food and thanked the chefs. You two really were my biggest challenge for years. It's going to be really quiet around here without you, Ace. The head chef cheered. But Luffy's still here, so I'm definitely not going to get bored. Luffy pulled a cheeky grin and gave the head chef a thumbs up, which didn't spell good news for him. Ace just gave a hearty laugh and patted Luffy on the head. He was going to miss his little sister. He just wished he was able to protect her, but he knew that she was a grown girl and was going to be the king of the pirates. When Ace and Luffy had finished breakfast, they walked out onto the deck where Whitebeard and some of the commanders were there ready to see Ace off. Brat, Whitebeard called out. You always were a brat and forever will be. Thanks, Pops, Ace replied sarcastically. That's my boy. The commanders all gave their condolences for putting up with Luffy his whole life and then finally got his freedom. Luffy threw a fit at them because of it, but ended up just puffing up her cheeks, which made them laugh. That was when Thatch hooked his arm over Ace's shoulder and whispered something into his ear. I've got something for you for your trip, Thatch whispered. He reached into his coat and pulled out a photo of Luffy when she had landed on the Moby Dick after she landed in the Fountain of Youth. Her clothes snuck to show the curves in her body. Ace snatched the photo out of Thatch's hand and about to burn it before Thatch punched him in the face full of hockey. Are you stupid? Thatch shouted. This is the only one I have. If you're not going to take it, then I'm putting it back in the album. That's not going in the album, you walnut, Ace retorted. Ace and Thatch began a wrestling match on the deck while Jozu, the 3rd Division commander, looked quizzical. I've heard Thatch get called a lot of things, Jozu started, but never a walnut. The group laughed as the wrestling match went down. It was when Marco had to stop the fighting did Ace get ready to leave. Luffy dived into the water and turned into a mermaid and took the rope of the small dinghy. Ace threw his bag onto the boat and waved out to Moby Dick. Luffy went full speed and asked her mother to direct her to Dawn Island. The trip to Dawn Island only took a little under an hour when Luffy caught up in a fast current. Dawn Island was just as peaceful as ever, and on the cliff where Sabo had started his journey waited Dayton and Makino. "Looks like the brats are back," Dayton commented. "Oi," Luffy called out. Everyone had a smile on their face and Ace hugged Makino and Dayton. They didn't stay long, but just like with Sabo, Luffy gave Ace a peck on the cheek for luck and Ace was on his way out to sea. Makino offered for Luffy to come have lunch with her, and Luffy, as she was, didn't pass off the chance for another meal, and Makino led Luffy off to the village for a bite to eat. The villagers didn't know about Luffy's short return, but Makino was glad that Luffy was going to eat some of her cooking and tell her stories. Luffy's stories never ended, but when it was time for Luffy to go back to the Moby Dick, she hugged Makino and swam back home. The next week, just the same as Sabo, Luffy sulking about Ace's departure but perked back up and took her training seriously again. The crew was glad that Luffy was back on her feet and on her way to greatness. It had been 2 years since Ace left, and the bounty posters kept coming in, and Sabo's bounty poster was back on the wall. The crew found it strange that Sabo's bounty poster never updated and wondered what happened to him, but figured that he was fine if there was no news of a capture. Luffy never thought about it. She was too busy training to become king. That was when Whitebeard heard of news of someone challenging Jinbei. The Moby Dick was turned around and they followed the Vival card for Jinbei. Luffy was on Whitebeard's lap the same time they heard the news. They didn't get a specific name of the person who was on the verge of defeating Jinbei. Luffy was very curious. Jinbei had been her teacher for her water ability, but annoying history teacher. Luffy would always fall asleep, but Jinbei would always hit her awake. Luffy really appreciated Jinbei for that. He was the only fishman she knew that didn't treat her like royalty. It was relaxing for her. As the ship got closer to island that housed the fight, they caught sight of Jinbei's figure and watched as it collapsed. "I heard you looking for me, brat," Whitebeard called out. "Yeah, I'm here to defeat you, old man. Cheeky brat." Luffy poked her head over the railing and spotted Ace and his crew. She mouthed an "oh," and smirked. Ace was on the verge of collapsing but used his remaining strength to create a pillar of fire. Ace held up the firewall to allow his crew escape, and they didn't want to leave Ace by himself. "They're good people," Luffy commented. Whitebeard patted Luffy's head and said Marco to pick up his stupid son and his crew. Ace collapsed and the rest of the Whitebeard pirates captured Ace's crew. They were tied up in ropes and sitting on the deck and spectated by the crew. "So this is Ace's crew," Marco said. "He chose some pretty good people. What have you done with our captain?" One man shouted. Luffy sat in front of them the whole time and answered the question. "He's fine. Nate-chan's taking care of him and Doc Nee." "Lucky bastard. Papa, are they going stay?" Luffy asked. "That'll be up to Ace." Ace didn't come around until later that day. He had thanked the nurses and the doctor properly, but then gave them a stern warning that he wasn't part of their crew and they shouldn't take him lightly because he wasn't a kid anymore. The nurses and the doctor just laughed it off and sent Ace on his way. "Right, my crew," Ace remembered as he ran out and onto the main deck where Luffy was sitting in front of the vice captain having a starring contest, which seemed to him that Luffy was on the verge of winning. "What's going on? Old man, release my crew." "I don't remember you being so rude, brat," Whitebeard replied. "You release them. I'm not stopping them." Ace shot a bullet of fire over at the ropes and released his crew from sitting on the cold deck. Ace's crew ran over to Ace to see how he was doing, but the only one that didn't see to Ace was the vice captain, who was still staring into Luffy's eyes. "Luffy," Ace shouted. "Yep." The vice captain was broken out of his trance and noticed his captain was up and about. "Captain Ace, you're up. I'm so glad you're okay." Ace ignored him for the moment and glared at Luffy. "Luffy, you're 15. Act like it." Luffy stuck her tongue out at Ace and jumped onto Whitebeard's lap. The Spade Pirates watched Luffy jump up onto the strongest man in the world without a bat of an eyelash, and then witnessed her continue to climb up onto Whitebeard's shoulders and sit on him, with her upper body resting on his head. Is she allowed to do that, Captain Ace?" "She's done it since she was 4. Ace replied straightly. A random pirate had come up to Ace to ask his own personal question. "Captain Ace, you seem to know her. What's that about?" the man asked. Ace stayed silent for a moment before replying. He felt like he was going to regret it. "That's Monkey D. Luffy, my little sister." There was a pause before a chorus of "what's" had filled the air. Ace told them to shut up and then pointed at Whitebeard and declared that he was going to defeat him and there was nothing he could do about it. Luffy had bent over further and asked her father if that was fine with him. After all, the nurses were going to be happy with him if he overexerted himself. "Cheeky brat, I'll do what I want." Luffy laughed at his reply and then heard shouting from below her and saw Ace laid out on the deck fast asleep. Day after day Ace had tried to beat Whitebeard, however, never came close to defeating him. He almost looked like he was revolting against Whitebeard, but the crew just watched with an interested eye. Luffy wasn't too pleased with going to get Ace when he was thrown into the ocean. Some days she would get him and then there were days where he had her meet and she would let someone else get him. It was only until a couple of months later did Ace finally gave up and joined the Whitebeard pirates officially. Luffy was excited because she got to see Ace's tattoo on his back and really happy for him, just like how she was happy about Whitebeard's mark on her necklace.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
It was later in the next year, when Luffy was 16 and Ace was 19, he had accepted to be the 2nd Division commander. A party was thrown for Ace in his new position and Luffy was both happy for him and a bit annoyed that he was getting so high into the ranks, but she wasn't going to waver. Chapter 38, Leaving the Crew. It was a busy day for the Whitebeard pirates. The commanders were out doing errands and dealing with pesky pirates. Luffy was training with some of the lower level pirates that offered to help train her. Luffy, being at the age of 16 and turning 17 in a couple of months, was training even harder than ever. She didn't want to lose to anyone if she was going to be Pirate King. "Oi, we're back," a voice yelled out. Luffy recognized it immediately and ran out towards the main deck. "Thatch Nee, welcome home." Luffy cheered. However, her joyous moment didn't last long when something in her gut twisted and made her feel sick. Thatch immediately noticed something was wrong and looked down at his little sister with a puzzled look. "What's wrong, Luffy?" Thatch asked, concerned. "It's not a stomachache, it is. Should you see one of the nurses? You have a devil fruit, don't you?" Luffy asked venomously. "Huh, yeah, why do you ask? I hate them." Luffy felt too uncomfortable being around a devil fruit and left, leaving behind a confused 4th Division commander. Thatch reported to Pops about his find in the damage report, but then remembered about what happened with Luffy and decided to ask Pops for some advice. "Why don't you ask Luffy about it?" Whitebeard replied. "Do you think she'll talk to me about it, Pops?" Thatch asked. "Don't you have faith in your family? I'm sure Luffy will tell you if you ask her. You know how she is." "Thanks, Pops." Thatch jogged off to find Luffy, but first put the fruit in his room and locking the door behind him. It was best if he didn't bring it with him when he went to talk to Luffy about it. If something made a crew member uncomfortable, it was usually eliminated. Thatch bumped into a couple of other commanders, who were neck-deep in paperwork and didn't have time to talk to him about trivial things, so they ignored him. He didn't mind. He knew what it was like to have to deal with a lot of paperwork and have Marco on your back about it, and continued his search to find Luffy, but had ran into Vista, who didn't look like he was doing anything in particular. "Oi, Vista, have you seen Luffy around?" Vista turned to his fellow commander, straightening up to his full height and began twirling his mustache. "Luffy, she's probably on figurehead. Why do you ask? She doesn't like devil fruits for some reason, so I'm going to ask her about it." "Don't startle her then. She's probably asleep." "Haha, thanks, I'll keep that in mind. Sure you will, after 10 years of getting you ass knocked into the sea. I'm sure this time it'll stick." Vista taunted. "Hey, those photos were worth it." Thatch replied. "Catch you later, Vista." Thatch walked off towards the front of the Moby Dick. He thought about how much Luffy had grown over the years, and even though she was physically 16, she was still the same tiny brat that the crew knew and loved. He also thought about Ace and Sabo. They were also brats, and even though Ace was more trouble to handle, he really was part of their family, although sometimes he wondered whether it really was worth having him on the ship with the amount of times his pranks were set off. But something felt wrong when he thought about Sabo. There wasn't any new bounty poster of his and it worried him a bit. There was no news of Sabo's capture or death, and he really hoped that it wasn't the latter. But he put his faith in the oldest sibling. After all, the Whitebeard pirates raised him, and if anything he was far from dead, otherwise he was going to kick his ass whether he was dead or not. Thatch made it to the figurehead and found Luffy fast asleep in the sun. Kneeling down, Thatch pinched her cheek, stretched it and released it, which shocked the girl awake. "What do you want, you bastard?" she blurted automatically. Luffy rubbed the sleep out of her eyes, placed her straw hat back on her head and turned to the culprit that woke her up. "Ah, Thatch Nee, what is it?" Luffy accused. Thatch sat down next to Luffy and looked out toward the sea, thinking of the right words to say. "Luffy, can you tell me why you hate devil fruits so much?" "Yeah, sure." Thatch almost fell over. It shouldn't have been that easy. Luffy stared blankly but just grinned at her brother's antics, even though she didn't know why he was doing it. "You're so funny, Thatch Nee. So you'll tell me?" "Yeah," Luffy started. She looked out to sea, recalling the memory. "It's just a memory of one of my ancestors, but it was given to all of us that descended from her. It was thousands of years ago. One of the first sea gods thought that it was best that she ruled over the world, since she covered most of it, and went down from the heavens and began tormenting the people. It was a horrible fate. The gods revoked her right to having her powers and turned her into water. Her powers became the devil fruits to apologize to the people that she tormented. The memories of what she did were engraved into every descendant to prevent the same thing from ever happening again, but all we want is a bit of freedom, and I think we'll be happy." Luffy gave a huge grin to Thatch, and all he could do was hug the girl. "Oi, Luffy, I'll keep that fruit in my room for safekeeping, and I'll choose what I want to do with it when you leave so it won't bother you, okay?" "Really? Thatch Nee, you're the best." Luffy hugged the man back and he gave the girl a reassuring pat on the back, but the moment was ruined when Luffy's stomach growled loudly. Ha ha ha, let's get some food, shall we? Thatch encouraged. Yeah. Unannounced to the fourth commander and the daughter of the sea, one particularly meticulous man was watching the whole conversation from a safe distance, grinning to himself. Oi, Teach, what are you doing? We've got to get back to work. Ziahaha, I'm coming. Just watching the waves. Teach knew that Thatch would keep the devil fruit safe at all cost and wouldn't break a promise, and figured it was best to wait till Luffy left the ship when he were to commence his plan. After all, if he rushed himself, Luffy would have his head on a pike the second something went wrong. He knew that he couldn't kill Thatch, otherwise Luffy would immediately feel it and hunt him down. If anything, he was just going to have to leave Thatch in critical condition so he couldn't get in his way. The Moby Dick stayed the same for the next couple of months, and Luffy's birthday rolled up sooner than expected. The crew gathered around on the day before the girl's birthday and gathered as much booze and food as they could and threw a party in commemoration of the youngest and last sibling heading out to sea. Cheers and drinks were thrown all around, and Luffy was stuffing her face full of food until Jozu sat down next to the small girl. Ah, Jwazu ni, what cha doing? Luffy asked. Jozu, although being an intimidating man, always felt comfortable next to the carefree girl. He had watched her grow up into a fine woman alongside her brothers and hoped she would be successful in the pirating world. Little Luffy, Jozu started. He liked the nickname that he gave Luffy and she liked it as well. Why don't you give the crew a few words before you leave? I'm sure they would love to hear from the birthday girl. Fine. Luffy stood up and yelled out, my brothers and sisters. She instantly got their attention. Shishishi, Jozu ni said I had to give a few words. I don't want to, but I guess I have no choice. Thank you, for taking care of us all these years. Thank you for taking us in when we had nowhere else to go. I love all of you. Luffy was soon buried under the Whitebeard pirates, hugging and crying over losing their baby sister. Damn it, I'm not a kid anymore. Luffy punched her way out of the pile of men and ran to her safe place, Whitebeard's shoulder, high and dry from tears. Perched on the old man's coat, she grinned at the pirate captain. Whitebeard only gave a grin in return. Luffy grew out her serpent tail and reached out for a jug of sake. She raised her small barrel of alcohol and told the crew to continue with the party and gave cheers to Whitebeard for being the best father she ever had. Luffy had packed her things the next day, which was her actual birthday and the day she was going to lose a majority of her powers. She knew that she wasn't going to be able to turn to water anymore, but she didn't care. She didn't want to have the power of a god, she wanted to become Pirate King with her own strength. She turned her hand into a ruby claw and flexed it. She knew that she was going to keep her transformations, but just how much energy it was going to take to use up some of the bigger transformations, but then again she didn't really care. When she went to the bathroom, she dunked her head under the water to see whether or not she could still breathe in it. Turned out she could, which she found a relief. She wasn't exactly used to holding her breath. Luffy picked up her backpack and placed it on her back, fixed her gold seashell necklace with the Whitebeard Jolly Roger on the back, and then placed the straw hat Shanks gave her that came with the promise of becoming the best pirate that ever lived. She walked out of her room but turned and took one last look at it. She was going to miss living on the Moby Dick, but she knew that she was going to see it again. Luffy walked out into the hall and up onto the main deck. The morning sun blossomed on her cheeks and danced across the scar under her eye that she inflicted onto herself in order to prove herself to Ace that she was a big girl at the age of 4. Waiting along the deck railing was Whitebeard and all of the commanders. Luffy, Haruta called out, I hope you have a safe trip. Haruta nay. Luffy smiled. Luffy noticed that the commanders were in order by division number and started from the last. Luffy walked over to Izo and gave him a huge hug and a kiss on the cheek. She really looked up to him. He may have been a cross-dresser, but she never saw it as a problem. He helped her with cooking and sewing up old clothes that she loved to wear and would always nag her when she ran off from him when he was in charge of looking after her when they were on an island. Even though Izo was a man, Luffy still had the habit of call him her sister. Thanks you, Izo nay, for always fixing my clothes. No problem, kiddo. I just wonder if you can find someone as good as me that'll fix you up when you get into fights. Izo patted Luffy on the head and let her go say thanks to the other commanders. Next was Fosa, 15th Division Commander. Luffy gave him a hug and kiss as well. He was like the tough grandfather that loved to tell exaggerated stories to Luffy when she was a brat. He loved it when she would sit on the other side of the dining table to him and they would play a one-on-one game of cards while he told her story of his trip on the Whitebeard ship. He tried to train her in swordsmanship but easily gave up when she wouldn't listen to him. Thank you, Fosani, for telling me so many stories about the crew. I'm too old to be your brother, Luffy. More like cocky uncle. Fosa gave a firm and reassuring grip on Luffy's shoulders that said that she could always turn to him when she needed it. Following after was Jiru, who preferred a high five and also got a kiss. Luffy felt that Jiru, despite being a lot older, was just as childish as her. She loved it when she played tag with him on the decks, and even though he was exceptionally faster than her, had always allowed her a fair chance of tagging him. Thanks, Jiru ni, for always playing with me. Always ready to help, little sis. Atmos, being a relatively round man with heavy armor and of towering height, wondered what Luffy was going to do for greeting. He watched as Luffy hugged him and kissed him on the cheek. Atmos, although had the same grump demeanor as Jozu, was a lot more stubborn in accepting Luffy on the ship, but soon broke down when he saw that she could take care of herself while they were out at sea and would give her a bit of food when he thought that she was hungry. Atmos ni, thanks for protecting me when I wasn't paying attention. I'll be surprised when you were paying attention, cheeky brat. Haruto was next and they both gave each other a bone-crushing hug and kisses on the cheek. Luffy really admired Haruto. Being the only female commander but also not caring about girly stuff had helped her out a lot. They would always be a tag team when it came to pranking wars against Ace and Thatch. Haruto ne, thanks for always helping me get back at Ace ni and Thatch ni. No problem, Luffy. I hope you get a great crew that you can have fun with. Some of the guys on this ship can be a bit stiff. King Do, being Luffy's idea of manliness, really inspired her to be stronger. Luffy gave King Do a fist bump and a kiss on the cheek. He would always call out to her when he had the chance and give her a friendly tease but help her out with her training as well. He had told her all about the how cool a lot of things that went on in the world, and that even though there were a lot of things that applied to a man's code like suits of armor, he didn't discriminate if a woman or Luffy enjoyed that as well and would both shout at the setting sun on the figurehead for absolute no reason, but it was fun. King Do ni, thank you for being the manliest guy. The first no. That'll cause a few protests but I appreciate it. I bet you won't find someone as manly as me on your crew then. Curiel was a flamboyant man with colorful clothing and amazing guns that Luffy, as a kid, tried to get her hands on. The two hugged and gave each other a peck on the cheek. Luffy always remembered when she was playing near the cannons and an enemy ship was coming near and the 10th Division had stormed in ready for attack, and Curiel came and dragged her to his side and she watched as he took out the enemy from such a long distance. It amazed her on the marksmanship that her older brother had. Curiel ni, thanks for trying to teach me how to shoot and I promise not to touch the cannons anymore. I never let you touch the cannons anyway, even if you did I'd beat your butt. Shishishi. Blenheim just gave Luffy a pat on the head and ruffled her hair a bit before bending over to accept his kiss on the cheek. Blenheim was around the same age as Fosa in the old age department but still had fighting spirit and stories to tell. He had helped Luffy with her training in becoming stronger and was a tough teacher at that. Blenheim ni, thanks for training me, although I won't miss it. You better not get yourself killed, you cheeky brat. Namur the fishman was a fierce fighter but a polite man towards Luffy. They hugged but Namur politely declined the kiss on the cheek, feeling like he wasn't worthy of one but got it anyway. While most of the older crew saw Luffy as an admirer, to Namur it was the other way around. Luffy and Namur had a sibling-like relationship but he had always referred to her as Sama, which she felt was too polite for her liking but soon gave up on correcting his horrifics. Namur ni, thanks for teaching me the ways of a fishman. Pleasure's all mine, Luffy-sama. Next up was Rikuyo, a brave and the most daring of the Whitebeard pirates. Luffy looked to his fearlessness and endless determination to defeat an enemy not matter how big a name they had. It really brought a smile to Luffy's face when she watched Rikuyo's fights from the railing of the Moby Dick. He always seemed to be the one that made Luffy smile when a crew member died during battle. Rikuyo ni, thanks for always cheering me up when I needed it. I'm glad I could help, Lil, sis. I hope you get Nakama that'll help you out when you're in a slump. Blamenko was a round and cheery person who always had a smile on his face and never hesitated to help Luffy when she was stuck with something heavy or just anything in particular. Luffy loved it when she, Ace and Sabo would place hide and seek on the ship and she would hide in Blamenko's pockets, but even though it was a great hiding spot she always laughed too loudly and was always the one to get caught first. Blamenko picked up Luffy into a hug and tossed her around a bit, which made her laugh like a child, and gave him a kiss on this cheek. Blamenko ni, thanks for helping out with everything, no matter how big or small it was. Luffy, as a treasured member of this crew you never gave this place a dull moment. Vista was gave a smile down at the teenage girl. He thought about how much she had grown up over the years. They hugged and Luffy kissed him on the cheek. Vista was one of the main trainers of the Brats, and even though they grew up fast and strong he would always remember when Luffy had ran off from his side while they were on one of the islands with his spending money and returned late back to the Moby Dick. And even worrying him sick, she gave him a rose that she bought for his birthday. He didn't want the rose to wilt and pressed it into one of his favorite books. Vista ni, thank you for training all of us even though we were so much trouble. No trouble at all, our little girl's all grown up. Thatch was next and Luffy honestly thought of Thatch as the craziest uncle brother she could ever have. They got along just as well as her and Ace, and that was something she never wanted to give up. All the times he cooked for her, even though it was the middle of the night. Even time he invited her to come with him to do night watch and he would tell her about the constellation and the story behind them, and even pranking the crew and against each other but mainly against Marco. Thatch tackled Luffy and squeezed the life out of her and all she could do was laugh. She gave a peck on the cheek and he released her. Thatch ni, thanks for being the best friend I ever had. Which reminds me, Luffy. I've got something for you to pass on to your crew. Thatch announced. He pulled out a huge book with a small gold plate on the front that had album engraved into it. It's the photo album that Ace and I worked on over the years. I want you to have it. If anything happens, your crew will be there when you need it. I think I can trust your judgment. Thatch knee. Jozu towered over the girl and almost gave her a menacing look, but Luffy knew that he was just worried about her leaving the Moby Dick on her own. He patted Luffy on the head and messed up her hair to the point that she had to fix it, which was his way of saying, stay on the ship, but he knew that wasn't going to work this time. When Luffy was a kid, when she would be under Jozu's watch that day, and even though all the other commanders warned him that no matter what, Luffy was bound to leave the ship no matter what they did, all Jozu did was give the girl a stern look and ruffle her hair, and she would move for the spot until he got back and then follow him around the rest of the day. The other commanders wondered how he did it, but he never told. Jozu ni, thank you worrying over me and the crew. It's my job, little Luffy. Ace came next and they hugged on sight, both giving each other ear-splitting grins to each other. Luffy gave him his kiss on the cheek. He had looked after her since she was born. Garp didn't trust Luffy's safety out in Fuchsia village being so close to the sea and brought her to Dayton, who pushed her onto Ace. Ace, being 6 at the time, felt annoyance that someone was stopping him from collecting money for his pirate ship, but when baby Luffy smiled and grabbed onto his shirt, he couldn't help but be glad she was there to be with him. Ace ni, thank you for being my brother from the very start. Luffy, thank you for being my little sister. The last remaining commander was Marco. He stood tall and proud about having watched Luffy leave the nest and go off into the world of her own. He was the strongest and most diligent out of the commanders and felt the most responsible for Luffy just as much as Whitebeard. All those times he woke up with an egg in his bed and pineapples outside of his door with notes that read, "We came to see you, brother." Although they were annoying brats, they were the best kids they ever raised on the ship. Marco ni, thank you for saving us the day we met and bringing us onto the ship. I'm glad I did it, kiddo. I never regretted it. Last of all was Whitebeard. The old man stood taller than all the commanders and was just as proud as Marco. Luffy was at a loss for words. She never had a father figure until Whitebeard came to Goa Kingdom and saved her from the world government and even agreed to bring Ace and Sabo along. He called her his daughter, his sea princess, and expected nothing in return except that she call him her father. It was the best feeling that she ever had. There was so much that she wanted to thank him for but just couldn't put it into a sentence. Whitebeard felt her hesitance, knelt down and scooped her up into a hug. Luffy felt tears brimming into her eyes. Papa, thank for everything. I'm so glad I have someone to call my father. My memory won't be as strong now, but I'm happy that I get to call you my family. Thank you, Papa. Don't cry now, my sea princess. This is meant to be a new adventure and I look forward to when you reach the top. Yep. Luffy wiped away her tears and gave Whitebeard his kiss on the cheek. He set her back on the ground and she took a step back, clutching onto her necklace. Papa, can I still keep your mark? Luffy asked timidly. Of course. That's proof that you're part of this crew and always will be. Whitebeard yelled. The commanders cheered and waved to Luffy with as much gusto as they could muster until she was out into the horizon. I'm the woman who's going to become the Pirate King. This was Luffy's new adventure into pirating world to become to Pirate King. Chapter 39, Trigger. The New World Sea, famous for being the most deadly sea in the world. Many have tried to conquer, however have all left due to embedding dangers that follow suit. On one particular day, the sun bet down on the Moby Dick. A ship that was famous all over the world for its figurehead of a whale and home to the strongest man in the world, Edward Newgate, also known as Whitebeard. However, on that particularly sunny and cheery day, it always brought a shadow. Despite the Moby Dick being home to Whitebeard and over 1,600 men and one little sea god, Luffy had been sweating up a storm while she was playing on the main deck and began wandering around the lower decks away from the sun. Luffy was still at the tender age of 13, Ace had left the ship to make his own crew and Sabo had been out at sea for over 2 years now. Luffy had her straw hat resting on her head, an oversized, white dress shirt on that hid her blue shorts. I wonder how Ace ni and Sabo ni are going with their adventures. It must be fun. I can't wait to make my own crew. Luffy thought to herself. Through the large hallway, Luffy trotted by some of the crew members. All of them greeted the little girl that almost had a permanent residence on the Moby Dick. Oi, Luffy-chan, where are you off to? One of the crew members asked. Ah, Daruma ni, I heard the 2nd Division has shaved ice. Luffy cheered. Really? Lucky. Mind getting some for me, Luffy-chan? Nope. If you want some, get it yourself. You're so cold to your big brother. Shishishi. Luffy walked away from the crewmate and made her way to the 2nd Division. She had passed a lot of other members and she felt a bit of a heavy atmosphere as she got closer to the 2nd Division, but Luffy ignored the feeling and continued walking. However, when she got there, what she wasn't expecting was something that was going to embed itself deep into her mind for a long time. Luffy finally got to the 2nd Division's lounge or dining area and pushed open a heavy wooden door. However, she was welcomed with one of the members saying, Sabo hasn't been active for 2 years now. I feel bad to say, but the poor kid probably died at sea. The large wooden door fell open and the whole room fell silent. The member that had said that Sabo was dead turned around when the room fell silent and immediately spotted Luffy standing in the doorway. She had tears in her eyes from the sudden claim. Sabo ni. Luffy whimpered. Her sadness suddenly turned to rage. Sabo ni isn't dead. He's too strong to be dead. You guys are a bunch of liars. Whoa, Luffy. We're not saying that Sabo's dead. It's just that the Grand Line's weather and everything else, and the fact that there hasn't been any news of on Sabo in 2 years. It's just that the chances are really high. The man said. I feel sorry for him. Another said, he was part of this crew too. I wish we knew what happened to him. The chatter about Sabo's well-being spiraled out, ignored the hurt Luffy that was standing in the doorway. The little girl couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her oldest brother being dead was just unheard of. But in that moment she had some self-doubt. She knew for a fact that Sabo wasn't dead since she didn't feel the same sort of pain that she did every time a crew member died. Whenever someone Luffy cared about passed away, as part of the fall of the sea god, a needle-like pain will be felt in her heart, metaphorically that is. However, this causes tremendous mental strain on her, and if someone really significant were to pass away, the damage could be life-threatening. Many of the recantations of the Daughter of the Sea would often hid away from people in order to avoid the pain of dealing with the losses. However, that sort of information isn't known until they actually make connection that pass away. The idea that Sabo was dead was unheard of. If he was dead, then she would have immediately felt it. But a small virus of doubt started to build its home inside Luffy's head, and it was far from pleasant. In the girl's state of panic, she ran from 2nd Division and went to the other divisions in order to find some sort of hope for her brother's survival, however, to her devastation. Sabo. Sorry, Luffy, but he probably got swept up at sea. We should have taught him more about navigation than fighting, huh? I feel sorry for the brat. He was the smartest out of the 3. Sabo ni isn't dead. Luffy screamed. What almost silenced the whole ship by the sudden shout had also brought the commander's attention to his division. Oi, what's going on in here? It was Commander Rikuyo, of the 7th Division. Luffy, what's the matter? The commander saw his little sister fallen on the ground, her legs unable to support her anymore. Her hands were laid out in front of her to keep her from falling any closer to the floor. Rikuyo couldn't see her face since she was staring too intently at the ground. But when she turned to him, what he saw broke his heart. Luffy's face was ridden with tears. Her usually cheerful and hope-filled chocolate brown eyes that should melt a person's soul with a single stare were now glazed over with ice and were devoid of all hope. Her mind had almost collapsed. Enni is dead. Rikuyo didn't know what to do. He didn't hear of anyone on the ship dying, but with how the atmosphere was in the room, it didn't take long for him to figure out whom they were talking about. Rikuyo didn't know anything on where Sabo was, but he, along with a lot of the other commanders that helped train the brats, refused to believe that the oldest was dead, but it was his job now to look after the youngest that was still on the ship in their place. Rikuyo cracked his knuckles and hit the girl over the head. This was a shock to the 7th Division that was present. Luffy, Rikuyo shouted at the top of his lungs. This had snapped the girl out her trauma. Sabo's dead if you believe he's dead. Do you hear me? Luffy sniffled and nodded her head. Do you think Sabo's dead? Rikuyo asked enthusiastically. Luffy rubbed her eyes and shook her head. She wasn't going to give in if her brother wasn't going to give in either. Oi, Commander Rikuyo. Rikuyo and Luffy turned to the 7th Division, who was fired up by their commander's speech. We don't think the brat's dead either. After all, the Whitebeard pirates trained him. Sabo is smarter than a lot of us. He knows what he's doing. Luffy slowly started to believe again and slowly began to smile again after the long hot day. She felt herself get lifted off the ground and then watched the 7th Division get smaller, and her hands rested on top of light brown dreadlocks that bellowed to the commander Rikuyo. Rikuyo ni. Don't you worry, Luffy, Sabo is definitely alive as long as you believe him to be. Rikuyo carried Luffy out of the room and into the hallway. He hoped that he was able to reach her with his words, but he knew that what she had dealt with that day was forever going to leave a scar in her heart. It was difficult for her since she had went to all the divisions to ask about Sabo and everyone had a seed of doubt about their brother, but in the very least, he thought, he was able to help his little sister not give up on someone so important to her. Rikuyo ni, where are you going? Luffy asked through some sniffs. Just you wait. I'm going to show you something amazing, just you hold on. Luffy gripped onto Rikuyo's dreadlocks for dear life until he told her to let go a little bit since it was hurting his head. Luffy giggled a little bit from Rikuyo's teasing as he climbed up the rope ladder that led to the crow's nest. Luffy didn't say anything, she just played with the man's hair until they reached the top. Look out there, Luffy. Rikuyo said. Luffy did as her brother asked and she saw the hot setting sun slowly drift below the horizon as Sea King jumped and danced in the orange sea. It was a sight to behold. Luffy started to tear up again as she went over the day's events and gripped onto Rikuyo's hair tighter. Listen, Luffy, Rikuyo started, out there are thousands, maybe, millions of people that you will meet one day. Whether they will be your friends or your enemy is up to you. But out of those millions of people there is the chance that one of them is your brother. If you give up on him, then what's to say that he'll give up on you? Don't give up on you, brother, Luffy. Can you promise me that? Yeah, I promise. Now wipe your tears. We're getting ice cream. Ice cream. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Daughter of the Sea by Kuchia-chi. The end.